This is Block 9, The Liberal Establishment, Section 4, The Rise and Fall of Nixon, with this section, The White House Tapes. The more dirt that is uncovered about the president, the more dirt people want to know. What did the president know about Watergate? People are asking. When did the president know about Watergate? Did he order it? Did he orchestrate a cover-up? Was he innocent? Did all administrations do that? The press tracked Nixon down, who's dealing with all these international crises, every day for years on end. And then one day it leaked out that the White House had a taping system that had been installed. This taping system would pick up any and all conversations that the president had in the most important rooms. Everyone said, "Oh my God, the president is taped? Where are the tapes?" Nixon at first said, "Tapes? Tapes? What tapes?" It's actually incredibly ironic. When Nixon had become president in 1969, the recording system had already been there since the days of Johnson. Nixon's first reaction was to rip it out. He didn't want this recording system recording his every utterance. But then he reconsidered. He said, "Look, the press hates me to such a degree. The press, hates me to such an extent that the only thing I can do to make sure that history gives me a fair reading is to have every word of mine that I say recorded so people can't twist my words long after I'm gone." So he actually had the taping system ripped out and then reinstalled, so he wouldn't have to deal with a hostile press trying to support his long-term legacy and image. But now people knew that there are these tapes out there, tapes of White House conversations. If President Nixon ordered a cover-up or participated in a cover-up, it would clearly be on these tapes. Nixon said, "I'm not giving you the tapes." He invoked what's known as executive privilege. Executive privilege says that it's one of the checks and balances, that the president does not have to come running every time Congress says run. Nixon said that the White House tapes contained secret conversations, sensitive conversations, and that if people knew when they were giving the president their opinion that information might be hauled in front of Congress one day, the president could never get accurate, unbiased information. So Nixon said the contents of these tapes is executive privilege, that a congressional subpoena cannot get these tapes, that they are hidden behind the wall of checks and balances and separation of powers. But Nixon's small victory is short-lived when his own special prosecutor, a guy by the name of Archibald Cox, when Archibald Cox told Nixon, "Hey, you know what, Mr. President, you really have, even though you appointed me to this position, the law says you have to turn over those tapes." So now Nixon's in a bind. He says he doesn't have to hand over the tapes, but his own special prosecutor that he appointed under Democratic pressure says, "You know what, Mr. President, you have to release those tapes. You cannot claim executive privilege." Then Nixon's own Attorney General advised him the same way. Nixon's own Attorney General said, "Look, you can't claim executive privilege with these White House tapes." This was not an acceptable answer to President Nixon. On a Saturday night, Nixon fired him. He called in a guy by the name of Ruckelshaus. He was an assistant undersecretary, under Attorney General person. And he met him in the White House and he said, "You're the new Attorney General." And then Ruckelshaus said, "Well, you know, Mr. President, you really have to turn over these tapes. You can't claim executive privilege." Nixon said, "All right, you're out." So in the span of about an hour and a half, Nixon fired 2 attorneys general. The one that he had for a long time, Richardson, and the new guy, Ruckelshaus, who was fired for not just doing what Nixon wanted him to do. Finally, Nixon searched around and found an attorney general candidate who would simply do what Nixon wanted him to do. Also fired that night was Archibald Cox, the special prosecutor, who said to the president, "Hey, Mr. President, you have to hand over all of these tapes." When Americans woke up on Sunday morning, they were greeted by blaring headlines, "Saturday Night Massacre," that on a late Saturday night, Nixon had not only fired one attorney general, but two attorneys general, and he had fired the special prosecutor that he himself had put into position to investigate these crimes. It served to make Nixon look incredibly, incredibly guilty. That if you're firing people and only accepting people who support your position on everything, it makes you look very, very desperate. And it also made people think that something on these tapes the president does not want us to see. And pressure mounted more and more every day on Nixon to release the tapes. In the spring of '74, Nixon tried to get out ahead of the demands, and he released a portion of the tapes that he kind of picked that said, all right, these are the relevant tapes. There was nothing incriminating, of course, in those particular tapes that Nixon released, although his constant profanity shocked the American people. It was F-bomb this and F-bomb that all the time coming out of Nixon's mouth. Congress said, no, Mr. President, not enough. We want all of the tapes. Nixon still claimed executive privilege. There's a saying that that somewhere on these tapes was the smoking gun, evidence that direct physical, absolute hard evidence that a crime had taken place. Congress took the case of executive privilege all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled on July 24th that executive privilege did not go so far as to protect the president from possible illegal activities, and that President Nixon had to turn over all of the White House tapes with no editing whatsoever. Nixon realized that if he refused to do so, he would be setting himself up for obvious impeachment and removal, that the president cannot ignore an order of the Supreme Court unless he's Andrew Jackson and very, very powerful, which Nixon was not. So Nixon reluctantly complied. Took a couple days to get the tapes together. He tries to get ahead of the inevitable disclosure again. He tries to release some tapes on his own timeline. He published 3 tapes before the court said that he had to publish all of them. In one of the 3 tapes, Nixon is clearly heard on tape. Everyone could hear it. It was obvious. It was clear it was the president's voice. It was clear what he was saying. On one of the 3 tapes that the Supreme Court ordered Nixon to turn over, and Nixon reluctantly turned over, on one of those 3 tapes, there's Nixon's voice ordering the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, to prevent the FBI from investigating the Watergate break-in. That was the so-called smoking gun that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Nixon had actively tried to cover up the Watergate break-in. This was it. This was proof that the press and the American people had been after for almost 2 years, that Nixon had broken the law, Nixon had abused the power of his office, and now the end game was not long in coming.